Welcome to The Lost Legends. I'm Adam D. Jones, and this podcast is all about the weirdest and most overlooked stories from history. I'm starting out with a fascinating dark tale that I bet you've never heard. It's one of the earliest vampire stories from medieval England. Naturally, vampires are not the sort of thing I expected to study when I was in grad school. I spent my time learning about monks and the different approaches they had to communion. I know, I must have been the most fascinating person at all the college mixers. But at some point, while I was digging through communal theology, I unexpectedly came across a story about a vampire. I say unexpectedly because this vampire tale didn't show up in a collection of scary stories, or myths, or legends. It came up in a simple, dry history book right alongside the real history. The author was an otherwise boring, tell-it-like-it-is monk named William of Newburgh. William of Newburgh isn't very famous, even amongst medievalists, but he's an important source for English history. And I'm not talking about vampire or paranormal history, I mean normal, dull history. He's a real historian who just happened to spend a few chapters of his book talking about monsters. Real monsters, at least as far as Newburgh and his colleagues were concerned. Let me paint the picture for you. William of Newburgh lived in England in the 12th century, and he wrote about a civil war that we now call the Anarchy. That should already give you an idea of how lawless and unstructured the world was. English towns had no societal structure and no one to help them. They were on their own while battles raged around them. And for reasons we may explore in the next episode, there were plagues popping up all around, making it a very difficult time to live in England. This is the world William of Newburgh wanted to tell us about, and he's one of the most important historians of the time period. But as he learned about the lives of the people of England, he noticed certain stories kept popping up again and again. He pushed them aside because he wanted nothing to do with them. But eventually he says he just couldn't ignore them. These stories weren't just coming from anybody. They came to William directly from people who were well educated and well respected, and they managed to convince William that something strange was going on in England. Finally, unable to ignore the strange tales any longer, William of Newburgh took up his pen and wrote down what might be the earliest recorded vampire story. Now, as you can imagine, a lot of historians don't take this part of history very seriously, but they should, because folktales like this tell us more about the lives of ordinary people than what most history books will tell you. The first of William's vampire stories begins with a funeral. In a small town in Buckingham, a man died and was buried in the family tomb. We might assume he was a person of wealth, since most families couldn't afford a tomb, but there's no way to know for sure. What we do know is that the tomb had a door and it was closed after the burial, and we learn later that no one was supposed to open this door without permission. And even though his tomb had been shut tight, the widow woke up that night when she realized, rather abruptly, that her dead husband was in the room. And not just in the room with her, but he was in the room on her. I'm serious. The text actually says that he entered her room and then nearly crushed her by, and I quote, the insupportable weight of his body. I'm not going to lie, I have no idea what that means exactly. Is it a euphemism for something awful? Does it mean he just laid on top of her? Held her down like a schoolyard bully? I honestly can't tell. Sometimes the old texts are unclear, and we never figure out exactly what they mean. It happened again the next night, and the next, and after a few days of this, the widow gathered up some of her neighbors, and they all agreed to wait up with her. And that night, when her dead husband showed up, he was surprised to see a small crowd waiting for him, a crowd that got together and actually chased him away. This happened again the next night, and the next. The widow kept her neighbors close, and for the next few nights they ran her dead husband off before he could do whatever it was he was doing. But he soon found other people to harass. His brothers lived in the same town, and soon he started showing up in their homes. They also began surrounding themselves with their neighbors, and before long, everyone in this Buckingham town was sleeping in groups, taking turns standing guard, because this dead man would show up at odd hours trying to catch them off guard. When he couldn't bother people at night anymore, he went and did something that vampires don't do in stories today. He showed up during the day and confronted people in broad daylight. We're told that he scared every single person in town. No one was able to stand up to him. The story gets more unusual at this point. The dead man seems to be able to hide from certain people when he's standing in plain sight, like he's only visible when he wants to be seen, or is only visible to people he wants to see him. That's not a very common part of the vampire story, but it does show up sometimes. In some stories, vampires are only visible to people who they want to see them. This happens in a episode of Buck Rogers, when a space vampire shows up and only his victims can ever see him. I don't know if the writers of Buck Rogers were familiar with William of Newburgh, but they might have been. Scared to death, the people of this small Buckingham town, they wrote a letter to the church asking for help. Now this might give you an indication of how lawless life was in country England during the anarchy. A town's being attacked by a madman, and the only place they can turn to for help is a priest. They reached out to the local archdeacon, the same archdeacon who later told the story to William of Newburgh. According to the archdeacon, the locals approached him with tears in their eyes, begging him to do something. The archdeacon then reached out to someone a little more qualified to deal with vampires, someone called the Bishop of Lincoln. This guy gathered a crew of researchers who found out that these monsters had appeared so many times that there was an abundance of stories to learn from. He quickly came up with a plan. Now you might have noticed that earlier I said this could be the first vampire story, but just now I told you that these stories had been spreading for a while. The reason I say it could be the earliest one is because it's the earliest vampire story that I've ever seen written down. Of course, this story really isn't very similar to the vampire stories that we know, but in my opinion, William of Newburgh's tale takes the idea of a dead man who comes back to life, which was common in many cultures, and it begins to just barely point the story in the direction of the vampire myth that we all know and love. Like I was saying, the respected Bishop of Lincoln had a plan, but it's an unusual one, almost underwhelming. His colleagues encouraged him to go and set the dead man on fire, which is how these things were normally dealt with. But the bishop didn't like that idea. He thought it was indecent and improper to set someone on fire, even a corpse. So he came up with the sort of solution I would expect if someone like Mr. Rogers had to stop a vampire. The bishop wrote a nice letter to the mean vampire. Technically, this was a letter of absolution, which was the Catholic Church's way of saying that someone is absolved of their sinful life, no longer to be judged for bad things they've done. A Catholic priest offers absolution under the assumption that the forgiven person will change their life and walk away from their bad habits. Again, they were sending this to a vampire. So the Bishop of Lincoln sent his incredibly optimistic letter back to the archdeacon with specific orders to visit the violent dead man's body in its tomb during the day and deliver the letter to him directly. Which can't be the sort of thing anyone feels prepared for when they leave seminary, but that's exactly what happened. They opened the tomb. They found the dead man inside, laying right where they left him. The letter of absolution was laid on his chest, and the tomb was closed. And, believe it or not, the monster of Buckingham never bothered anyone ever again. There's a lot more old vampire stories from William of Newburgh, so stay tuned for part 2 where we find out how to really kill a vampire if you're not going to be Mr. Nice Guy about it. If you want to stay on top of my work, check out authoradamjones.com and sign up for the mailing list. Until next time, I'm Adam Jones, and this is The Lost Legends.